Do they laugh? Do they love? Like they say in every song. If it's true, that's where I belong.
You are watching the December 7th, 2022 episode of Noisy Reality. Today we will be interviewing Jesse Walker. He is an editor, author, and radio personality. He has appeared on or in various media venues, including magazines, newspapers, books, public forums, radio, and television. He is currently books editor at Reason Magazine. He has authored 2 books. Rebels on the Air, An Alternative History of Radio in America, published in 2001. His second book was The United States of Paranoia, A Conspiracy Theory, released by HarperCollins in 2013. Walker's articles have appeared in the New York Times, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, The Los Angeles Times, and many other publications. Walker has spoken at venues ranging from the Cato Institute to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and from the Metropolitan Museum of Art to the Museum of Sex. He has been interviewed on NPR, the BBC, CNN, MSNBC, and countless other radio and TV outlets, and he has guest hosted the C-SPAN program, Afterwards. He has also hosted his own music and talk shows on community radio stations in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and in Everett, Washington. He co-directed a documentary, Talking Butt, about the 1998 tobacco settlement, and appears in the documentary, Free Radio. He was also in the mockumentary, Sean Connery Golf Project, and the science fiction film The Drive Time. Walker has won 2 Los Angeles Press Club Awards, for his articles in Reason Magazine, The Indestructible Idea of the Basic Income. His book The United States of Paranoia was named one of Amazon's top 20 nonfiction books of the year, and it also made the Chicago Tribune's list of the year's best books. Walker is a graduate of the University of Michigan, where he received a degree in history. Born in Massachusetts and raised in North Carolina, he now lives in Maryland with his wife and 2 daughters.
So much, Jesse, for joining us today. It's a great pleasure to speak with you.
Well, it's good to be back here again. It's been a while since I've been on Pacifica, and it's been a while since I've talked to a number of you. So glad to be here.
Well, we're gonna definitely share and discuss a lot of issues today. Well, first of all, I'd like you to share with us your thoughts about the present. In other words, this book was published in 2001. It was in the aftermath, at least in Pacifica, of a great decade of turmoil. And then now you've had all these digital revolutions going on ever since. The internet has completely dominated broadcasting, YouTube, video, live streaming, podcasting, everything else. I know I'm asking you to talk about something that take hours. What do you think is how media and audio
and I think
platforms are going?
I'm not always, a good prophet, but the stuff I had at the end of the book about where I saw internet radio going, I think was pretty prescient. And in particular, really sort of anticipating a lot of what was going to happen with streaming. The fact that we were, the old commercial radio model, which of course infected a lot of non-commercial radio too, was the idea that you find a format that's very narrow and you sort of pick what fits that format. It's not even so much to find the best possible programming so much as to find the programming that will not make people turn the dial away between commercials. And one thing streaming did was say, well, look, you don't have to depend on a radio consultant doing market research to come up with what's, the least offensive for your demographic. You can actually plug in the very exact contours of what you want to hear and get that delivered to you. And so that really changed things around on just sort of the commercial music side. I don't even want to say commercial broadcasting, because it is kind of the ultimate narrowcasting for audiences of one. But then the other thing, of course, was the podcast revolution. And actually, there's 2 other things. The first of them is the podcast revolution. I mean, there was a time when a radio program required an actual radio station. Now you can transmit a talk show, a documentary, an audio play, all sorts of things that in the past, you would have to go to a program director and make a case for, without dealing with anybody who's licensed to broadcast on the AM or FM bands. And that has, of course, allowed an explosion of creativity and variety, and some stuff that's terrible and unlistenable, but a lot of stuff that you just, before you might have heard it, on a good community radio station, might have been, on a Pacifica station at one of its high points, but it's something that's much more common now, and that's because of the just the entry barriers falling so low. Now, and initially, when podcasting was first starting back in the early aughts, when the term was coined, early or mid aughts, I don't remember the exact year. There was at the time I'd say, well, the difference is you can't do live broadcasts with this. It's always something recorded that you pick up and listen to later. But now, of course, you have live streams online as well, and that's not a really valid objection. Now, the other thing one might worry about is what happens to localism, though. I mean, this is something that community radio in particular was always, the place to go to find the kind of attachment to a local community that you wouldn't necessarily get from a commercial station, especially later in radio history when the big chains started taking so much over. And a lot of, when I was writing this, a lot of the struggles in the community radio world were between people who were like really attached to localism and those values versus the people who are more and more moving towards sort of cookie cutter, non-commercial radio, but imitating the kind of market research that was being done in commercial radio. And obviously, a lot of podcasts and streams are basically placeless. Certainly, a lot of the most popular ones are. But there is a sort of substratum of online where things are locally based, where, if nothing else, is because they're done by groups of people who are in a particular place and attached to particular institutions. I had the experience a few months ago. I went on a music podcast. We did like a special on Willie Nelson, and I was talking about Willie Nelson with these guys. And later that day, I brought my daughter to her drum lesson, and I just told her teacher, "Oh, hey, I was just on this music podcast." And the first thing he said was, "Oh, is it a local one? Is it some people I know?" I said, "No, these guys are in the Midwest." But so you still do have at least some degree of localism, but that's really the sort of place the sort of thing where it's built into, or should be built into, the FM band, and is not always coming through on the internet. So while there's a lot of complaints you can make about the state of online broadcasting, and I'm not trying to sit here with rose-colored glasses, and certainly there are legal barriers on the intellectual property side that can make things difficult for doing, really good freeform music programming online, or at least doing it legally, or it's true that a lot of the things that were, the people in Rebels on the Air were sort of beating up against the wall and trying to do, now a lot of people take for granted. And the old sort of hardly any choices on the dial world that and I think a lot of other people on this panel right now remember from when we were younger, that's not the status quo anymore. And we've got to kind of recalibrate and think about other things, like how do you get attention for what you're broadcasting? How do you reach, the other people doing things like this? What are the new forms these take? How do you deal with ham-fisted moderation decisions by platforms? And there's this guy, Ford Fisher, who does this amazingly useful service. He just goes to demonstrations all over the country, left wing, right wing, unclassifiable, and he interviews people and does raw footage of what's happens, and certainly all kinds of very useful footage, like during 2020, but at other times as well, as far as just what's actually happening on the ground. And he's had stuff of his taken down by YouTube because he's interviewing people who believe something like the election of 2020 was stolen. And he's not saying that. And that's not the point of his broadcast, to advocate that. But, some algorithm picks it up, and some harried moderator maybe reviews it, but doesn't pay much attention, and it gets taken down. So that's the kind of barrier so there's new kinds of barriers that people didn't have to deal with in the 90s or the 70s or the 50s, but a lot of the old barriers have swept away.
Well, one thing that's interesting, whenever I go to journalism conferences these days, they always bemoan the lack of local programming, the lack of local news, both in print and broadcast journalism. And one thing that's amazing in your book, and we should note that it is a alternative history of radio in America, is that all throughout the creation of radio, there's always been these rebels, going back to when you had clubs, radio clubs before the First World War, where ham radio operators were getting together and jointly doing their thing. What strikes me in looking at your book, it reminds me of the recent scholarship on radio, is how before the implementation of all the different regulating acts, there was about, what I think you estimate, 30% of the broadcast in the United States was nonprofit. And then you look today, and then the thing you brought up, which I really loved because I forgot about it, was all that rebel citizen band stuff going on in the late 90s, all the truck drivers, doing their thing. And today there are 35 pirate radio stations in Brooklyn alone. So speak to that aspect of this desire for people to express themselves come hell or high water, and everything about regulations be damned.
Yeah, well, let's start with those radio clubs these were amateur radio operators, hams, and they invented broadcasting as we know it. And if you looked at a dictionary at first couple of years of the 20th century and looked up broadcasting, they would say it was a means of planting seeds. It would say nothing about one to many speaking over some technological means. And the initial assumption about radio was that it was just going to be another means of point-to-point communication. Someone on a ship talking to someone on another ship, or just talking to someone on shore. And then these amateurs coming on and having conversations with each other, and just like, wow, I'm in Detroit and I can talk with somebody in the Dakotas. This is amazing, which it is, of course, but especially seemed amazing then. But once you start doing that, people start realizing, it's not just that other folks could listen in on these conversations. You could speak to an audience of many, and you could start doing, primitive programming, basically. And the hams were the people who came up with the idea of broadcasting as we know it now. And when the regulations started, one of the changes that was done was you had to make this choice: were you going to be going to the ham band and just doing one-to-one communication, or are you going to get a license to be a broadcaster and you're doing one-to-many? But that was an artificial distinction that was invented by the government in the aftermath of World War I. I should actually add, just speaking of World War I, during World War I, the airwaves were nationalized. Virtually every station was shut down. There was like one or two that I'm forgetting the details of why they were allowed to continue. They had special exemptions, but basically everyone was either shut down or taken over by the government. And there were people who wanted to keep it that way. When I say nationalized, it was taken over by the Navy. I'm not talking about like a primitive NPR. I'm talking about the military running all these stations. And they did it for military reasons. They thought this could be a threat, having people being able to talk to each other through the ether in wartime. But one thing they found was that when they drafted people or had people volunteer, the people who were really good at radio were these hams who had just been teaching themselves and sharing devices with one another and inventing new ways to broadcast. I mean, technically, I'm not just talking about techniques of speaking to people. I'm talking about the techniques of the machinery, and really basically showing that their kind of amateur subculture was doing a better job of fostering these skills than the military's traditional top-down education. And so I said, you know what, it's actually even good for us to have this continue. But it's it was, they still had to sort of send them off into these two different directions, and that wasn't the end of local broadcasting, obviously, but it really did kind of tame the hams, and it sort of started the process of taming the broadcasters. CB you mentioned as well. It existed before the 1970s, but of course in the 70s it became a mass fad. And again, you had people, both doing cool and amazing things and doing the equivalent of farting into a microphone, because that's the combination you get when you open up the microphone to everyone. But it's better, I think, for free speech and cultural flourishing to allow you can't have one without the other. And then now with social media, something similar happening again. So it's a story that's happened again and again and again, and it often comes down to the creativity of talented amateurs operating in a local place.
Now, it's funny, whenever I go to the American Historical Association, what has blown my mind in the past 10 years is increasingly there are panels on radio history that again and again continue. And I attended one a couple of years ago on the foundation of the FCC. And I wanted to get your take on the various permutations of the FCC up to the war, World War II, because you mentioned a book I'd never heard of by Charles Siepman, Radio's Second Chance, which influenced Lewis Hill. And for those on the call or who will listen to this later, Radio's Second Chance is available to be downloaded. But talk about the regulations, how you see radio taking its sort of transformation into the big broadcasting media it became in the 20s and 30s, and then how Hill's relating to it and reacting to it as a young person during the war, and also the influence of a book that most of us don't know who are involved with Pacifica that influenced him, Radio's Second Chance.
All right, so there's three big topics there. So if I forget one in responding,
feel free to
tell me you forgot about the radio.
I will remind you.
Yeah, okay. As far as the early development of regulations, in the 20s, despite what I said about things like shunting the hams off to their own band and requiring people to get licenses, it was still pretty freewheeling. You had a lot of groups sort of rooted in local, institutions like, a church, a union, a 4-H club, getting a radio license. You had a lot of broadcasters who were just throwing everything up against a wall and seeing what sticks. So someone comes in and starts playing the fiddle on the air, and it's the old-timey music that people like, and maybe they're rolling their eyes in the studio and saying, oh, they want to hear something more modern, but it turns out there's a big audience for this, So it's very freewheeling. There's also some problems with interference as the band starts to fill up, but people are developing institutions to control that. And there's even I think in 26, sorry, I don't have the pages open in front of me right now, and it's been 21 years since I wrote this book.
Right.
You've read it more recently than me. I should be interviewing.
Right, I know.
Yeah, a court case where they were starting to talk about just treating interference as a tort. I mean, treating like rights to the ether a lot like riparian rights in water. And if someone interferes with your signal, then that's they've trespassed basically. But instead, the Department of Commerce, which was being run by Herbert Hoover at the time, future President Hoover, they didn't like that idea. They kind of, and I won't get into the details of the sort of, they basically did some stuff that guaranteed chaos on the airwaves. It made it harder for people to make to step in and enforce those boundaries. And then they presented themselves as the saviors. And they got the government to establish the Federal Radio Commission, which was the precursor to the FCC. And then under what was called General Order 40, they basically started giving priority to what they called general interest stations over stations that broadcast from a particular point of view. So if you were a union or a church or just like a civic organization that had a distinct point of view, you were going to lose or likely to lose a lot of your space on the dial or your hours of broadcast. So someplace that's aiming for straight down the middle programming that appeals to everyone. And that was the bias of broadcasting, especially in the early years of first the FRC and the FCC. There was also, and there's been some really good scholarship about this that came out after my book came out. There's a good book by, what's his name? By Clifford Dorkson called American Babel, which talks about how at the same time that you had these, the government cracking down on these small nonprofit stations and sort of paving the way for this kind of middle of the road ad-based network radio. A lot of local commercial stations were considered too ad saturated and were also being cleared out of the way. And again, the beneficiaries were these middle of the road network broadcasters. So, there's still obviously some creative stuff happening on the dial in the 30s and the 40s. Orson Welles is doing his thing. You've got what was that name of that great show? It was like Town Hall of the Air, where you might have there was one episode where they had a New Deal Democrat, a communist, a fascist, and a socialist, like just debating political economy. And it was just it's amazing to listen to, and they actually did a rebroadcast or a return to the same idea in the late 40s, but they took the communist out and the fascist out because it was a different era. But this was, so you still had some interesting things happening on radio, absolutely, but within these constraints that did not need to be there. And so when Charles Siteman came along, he did a study of broadcasting in Hibbing, Minnesota, which nowadays people think of as Bob Dylan's hometown, if they think of it. And in those days wasn't even famous for that yet. But it was a small city which had a local radio station, which was rare for cities of that size. But he looked and saw how much actual local content was on it and found very little. And he went through all these local groups that could be on the air and either weren't or were barely there. And so this was part, and the reason he called it Radio Second Chance was the FM dial was opening up, and he thought, well, if this is the kind of broadcasting that's dominating on the AM side, we've got this whole new frontier opening up. Now there were a whole lot of battles over then who would get to use FM, and we don't need to get into all of that, but it got kind of ugly with at one point the FCC changed where FM was being broadcast, so that this was early in the 40s, so that basically every receiver was now obsolete, and if you wanted to listen, you had to get a whole new FM radio to listen to what was at that point very sparsely populated band in the first place. But nonetheless, FM was there, and that was the soil that Lou Hill decided was, where he would go till. He saw FM as the new frontier, and that's where Lewis Hill eventually decided to establish his, the first Pacifica station in Berkeley.
Right. Now, one thing, many of us, we're going to be dealing with Pacifica in greater detail as we go on. I wanted to sort of explore the sort of richness of the book that goes into all these other folks. Mm-hmm. And one thing that struck me is I remember meeting Lorenzo Milam many, many years ago while he was still alive. And I wanted you to talk about his impact on community radio. Lorenzo Milam grows up in Florida. He's listening to black DJs at the time, as you talk about in the book. So talk a little bit about Lorenzo Milam and his impact, along with Hills, on the whole community radio phenomenon.
Yeah, so Lorenzo, he's born in the early 30s in Florida, as he said, and he, I've sometimes said that what he wound up trying to do in radio, he didn't necessarily formulate it this way in his mind, but he remembered the kind of creative grassroots of the people kind of broadcasting he was hearing from these tiny little black programs in the Deep South. And he also had been exposed to the very highbrow BBC Third program, which was the name of one of the BBC channels. So it was kind of the, again, more highbrow, artistically oriented side of the British Broadcasting Corporation. And, in some ways, what he did was sort of fusing those two spirits into something new, which eventually became known as community radio. That's not how he conceived it when he started it. He worked a little while at Pacifica shortly after college in the 1950s, and he really liked parts of it, and there were some parts he really didn't like. He didn't like dealing with Stalinists, and in the 1950s in Berkeley, you had some Stalinists around. But that was all part of his formative experiences. He had also done some work at a kind of crappy a commercial radio station in the 50s and knew that that was very much what he didn't want to do. So he didn't want to do crappy commercial radio, and he didn't want to do Radio Stalin. So within those constraints and with the inspirations from the third program and from those stations he'd heard growing up, and just all sorts of things happening in the air, the Beat Generation and so on, he was part of that world. And also a political desire to have discussions of peace on the air. I mean, he was very concerned about the arms race. He initially wanted to establish a station in DC, and part of the reason why was, although I don't think that he really wanted to have I don't think at any point he wanted his radio stations to have only one point of view on them. He was very much a free speech, free debate guy, sometimes going way beyond what people would be willing to tolerate today. But he really he liked this idea of having pacifist programs being broadcast where senators and congressmen might stumble upon them and hear them. Well, that ended up not happening. The FCC gave him the runaround for years. There was talk going around that he was a communist because he had worked at Pacifica. The guy who complained about the Stalinists was being suspected of Stalinism. He eventually just kind of, he had come into some money. His father died, and his father had gotten some money in real estate and passed it on to him. And he used it basically. He said, "All right, I'm going to hire this respected law firm that's been doing communication law for ages, Haley Potter and Potts, I believe it was, and they will they will work this for me. We will apply for a station in Seattle, which is as far from DC as you can get. So the tender ears of the congressmen and senators will not be hurt by our subversive talk shows. And I'm just going to go travel for 2 years." And what do you know? They got him his station in Seattle, and in the early 60s he goes out there and starts building it. KRAB, it was nicknamed Crab. And this was before people were calling radio free forum, but he would call Crab free forum. He tried to basically broadcast any kind of music that you could not hear on other stations. He was very averse to playing stuff that you might hear on other stations. And I don't just mean in terms of pop music. I mean, there was a lot of classical music, but he did not want them to play the old war horses of the 19th century that you always heard in a classical concert or radio broadcast. So stuff that's either earlier or later and more experimental was more likely to be aired. And then, bluegrass, there was one time slot that was shared every other week by the Trotskyists and the John Birch Society. So they were and then when some of the Birchers decided to try to cause some trouble for them because of the leftists he was airing, then like the Birchers who had who were doing their broadcasts on Crab sort of interfered and said, "Hey, no, these guys are cool. They let us talk too." And he stayed at Crab until I think 68. I mean, he stayed there through most of the decade, and then he went off and started a series of other radio stations around the country until he kind of just got burnt out by the infighting at the station in Dallas in 1975. And after that, he mostly dropped out of radio. He would occasionally, he did like some experiments with low power television in the 80s and occasionally dipped his toes in, but he went on to do some other things. But because of not just the station that he started, but basically he had this attitude that if somebody really didn't like how he was running the station, he might stake them some money to go out and start another station elsewhere and run it their way. And in that way, and with his own sort of peripatetic wanderings and starting different stations in different places, and then it was the sort of gradual move of other folks who worked for these stations into other cities who had the idea, hey, let's see if we can pull things together and start a community radio station here. And even in terms of like some of the early college radio, I mean, colleges have been having stations broadcast since the beginning, but what we now think of as quote unquote college radio, alternative broadcasting, some of the first people to do this were inspired by things they heard on Crab and these other stations inspired by Crab, either directly or indirectly. You had the emergence of a community radio network. not in the sense of a centralized CBS or NBC or ABC, but what was called the Crab Nebula. All these stations that were informally linked, who would share programs. They didn't have the satellite uplinks or the internet back then, so they would literally send tapes through the mail. They called this bicycling from one to another. And also, by the way, I should say, a lot of them would take in broadcasts from overseas too. They would get on get Radio New Zealand, among other places, to send them what they have and see if there's anything that they felt was worth sharing with their listeners. And in this way, the community radio world emerged, so that you just didn't have these disparate experiments, but you had a whole bunch of stations that were communicating that eventually formed a National Federation of Community Broadcasters. And then when that started professionalizing to a point where a lot of people were feeling like it was getting a little too NPR-ish, there was like a Grassroots Radio Coalition broke away and started their own group called the Grassroots Radio Coalition. It was, and this was, Pacifica was sort of related to these broadcasters. And a lot of people moved from these stations to Pacifica, or from Pacifica to these stations if they moved from one town to another. There was a lot of sharing of programming, if you hear a Pacifica program on a station that is not one of the 5 Pacifica stations, the 5 Pacifica owned stations, then it is probably on one of these stations or one of these descendants. But this was a whole world, and Lorenzo was one of the founding fathers of it, arguably the most important of them, although there were other folks. Jeremy Landsman was there with him building Crab at the beginning. Larry Yurden and Tom. I could give a whole bunch of names who were there too. I don't want to be Lorenzo centric in my discussion, but it really was just a blossoming of creativity in the 60s and 70s, and then taking new forms in the 80s and 90s and afterwards.
Well, you start the book with a description of a radio station in San Marcos, Texas, KIND Radio. That just sounds like a lot of fun. These guys were having a great old time down there. And
I should say it's Kind Radio. They made it look like KIND, but they were called themselves Kind because they were all potheads, and the idea was Kind Bud. And they were a pirate station, so they didn't actually have FCC issued call letters. But yes, Kind Radio in San Marcos.
Well, that of course is the secret of some of the free formers I knew in the past. They were all potheads. Anyway, you have this great quote from Marshall McLuhan about Gene Shepard, talking about how, and Gene Shepard, of course, is looked on as sort of a predecessor to freeform radio of all types. And so it's an interesting quote. He says about Shepard, he's doing, quote, a new kind of novel that he writes nightly. The mic is his pen and paper. His audience and their knowledge of the daily events of the world provide his characters, his scenes, and moods. Now, you could apply that to all the crazy individuals and stuff that went on in Pacifica and all the other community radio stations in the 60s and 70s. I can think of Post, I can think of Josephson, I can think of Fass, of course, and then it's spilling out everywhere. And the influence of that on rock and roll stations, etc. What's your take on freeform? Because these days, if you go to a Pacifica meeting, freeform is my God, we're not going to do that anymore. So, and that, of course, is one of the richnesses and strengths of community radio and the broadcasting. So, is it just a 50s and 60s phenomena, or what do you make of it?
And 1 second, I cut off. Excuse me. So freeform really emerges in the 1960s. There are obvious precursors. I mean, the basic idea of freeform is the DJ picks his or her own records and is not limited by the boundaries of traditional format. Radio format, as we think of it today, where there's like the rock station, the country station, the R&B station, and so on, that really doesn't start to emerge till the 1950s. That's something that as television comes along and takes over the general audience, and radio has to commercial radio has to reinvent itself. That was the form it took. The reinvention was creating these different niches, and freeform was a way of breaking down the boundaries between those niches. Although it also became its own niche. And as I discussed, actually there were some interesting fusions. There's Actually, Lorenzo and Jeremy started a commercial station called KFAT in California, which was an interesting experiment. It was a free-form country station. In which the core is country music, although I think nowadays people would call it Americana because it was leaning more towards the weirder edge of country. But then within that, they could break down, they'll throw in a blues record, they'll throw in even the Dead Kennedys if they can make it fit, and their slogan was, it's all country music, it just depends on what country you're from. Freeform was that you have personality driven by the DJs, even if the DJ hardly says anything, the personality comes through the records they pick, the segues between records, the way you can combine different forms, genres of music to make it all flow naturally, wasn't considered an important part of it. I'm basically trying to make DJing a creative, a form of creative expression, not unlike what was happening in some clubs with disco DJs. And sometimes it was combined also with talk radio. You mentioned Bob Fast, Steve Post, Larry Josephson, who were like the trio of WBAI freeform DJs, and for all of them, their talking, it was as important as the music they played. In Bob Fast's case, for a while he was the only radio host who Bob Dylan would let interview him. Dylan would drop by and they'd talk on the air. So it basically. Freeform at least in its ideal form means no boundaries, or at least no boundaries other than the ones of where your art takes you and your taste takes you. Now, it's one interesting thing about it is that it takes hold not just in non-commercial stations, community stations, and so forth, but for a while in commercial stations, especially when people are trying to figure out what to do with the FM dial. When they find out that people are listening to FM, what are we going to do with these signals, especially places that own an AM station and an FM station, and they're not allowed to simulcast the same signal on both anymore, but what are they going to do with FM? Well, they started broadcasting to the hippies, and commercial freeform took hold for a while in that way. There's some commercial precursors. You mentioned Gene Shepard. He was doing his 1950s broadcast on a commercial station. And in fact, the one time you could ever hear ads on Crab in Seattle was when they would rebroadcast Gene Shepard's show, because they figured the ads were an innate part of the program, because Gene Shepard would come on and make fun of them after they aired. So you couldn't cut those parts out. But it was, so you had this interval where basically it was similar in some ways to to what was happening in the new Hollywood in the late 60s and early 70s, where studios were just letting directors do all kinds of experimental things because they felt like, we don't know what the audience wants. These guys, they seem to have some connection, what the young folks want. After a while, though, format starts to creep in again. You had the creation of AOR, album-oriented radio, or album-oriented rock. What it stood for changed depending on who was speaking. And a lot of stations sort of said, well, we're going to play these sort of core rock records that people liked in the freeform days, but we're going to rein in the DJs from doing the wilder stuff that might drive audiences away. For a while, people were able to hit this nice balance where, not unlike what they did with the freeform country at KFAT, they could say, look, we are a rock station, and you should stay focused on stuff that is in some sense rock music, but you get to pick your own records and play what you want and play what that your audience wants to hear. But we trust you to sort of mix it together. It's sort of semi-free form, but gradually that gets reined in, both because on one side of just sort of the fears of management and wanting to have a more controlled environment, to controlled station, but also because one thing about letting your DJs run free is some of them are very good at it and some of them are completely self-indulgent. And because this kind of freeform was born in trying to appeal to the hippie audience in the late 60s, early 1970s, as that subculture sort of started to calcify in various ways. Some of that also started creeping into the programming. one of the most successful freeform stations right now is WFMU in New Jersey, which had been part of that initial freeform. I mean, I say successful, they were originally a college station. And when the college went under, they managed to actually keep the station going because their audience was so loyal and so willing to support them. And they continued both, for years and years, both without ads and without any grants, any subsidies from the federal government, because they know that CPB money comes with strings attached and they don't want to deal with that. But one of their little secrets to their success, as one of their programmers told me, was they had their freeform revolution in the late 60s. After like 10 years, it was a sort of an ordinary, boring broadcast operation for communication students or whatever. And then the administration, the college administration, clamped down, and they had a few years in the wilderness of being a boring station before they returned to freeform glory. And by the time they returned to it, it was a new generation of people who had been through punk and were not trying to relive the old glory days of 1968 all the time, and were trying to do something new with freeform that wasn't constrained by even the kind of informal barriers that were imposed not so much by the format corporate suits as by just the kind of limited horizons of some of the DJs who had been doing this stuff. So I'm a big fan of freeform radio. I did it when I was a college DJ way back when at Michigan. I at various times since then, I've had an opportunity to get involved with a community radio station for a bit and do freeform. I think it's good to make it be a part of what a radio station does. I think it's the kind of thing where if you want to distinguish yourself from what's online and do the sort of things only a radio station can do, it's something you should think about. But it's obviously not the only thing that can be done or should be done with alternative radio.
Yeah, well, Fass used to close the studio door and get stoned, and the whole station would waft with his marijuana. That's the secret, of course, in his older age as he was doing community radio. Now, one of the things that's interesting about the book, and I'm going to bring in other people in a moment, is, we have the differences in culture as to the establishment of broadcasting institutions in the United States and Europe. And even in Europe, as you talk about, there's all these different kind of rebellious kind of manifestations, Radio Caroline, all these kind of experiments in community radio going on. And I wonder what your thought is about the problem of taking money from the government as one situation to discuss, because I've had friends of mine who work for German public radio, Dutch public radio, and we've talked back and forth about the traditions and how different they are in Europe. But again, the government will come in and lay its heavy hand on things. And then you have this hilarious outline in your book about how to run a radio station. And you divide it into benign dictatorship, malign dictatorship, the monstrous bureaucracy, the time-brokered snooze fest. I love that one. The Civil War, which essentially is what Pacifica is all the time, and anarchic meritocracy. That was a great breakdown of categories. So just speak before I bring other people in, and then raise your hands when you want to ask questions. Just that whole question about the government and the relationship to communications, taking CPB money, and then your interesting categorization of how community radio stations actually run.
Well, let's set aside the categorizations for the moment, because the first part is a big enough bite to chew on. Europe had the risks of government involvement in broadcasting are pretty obvious, right? I mean, there's in the worst case scenario, you have a government monopoly where the propagandists can take over. But even when you have things in a relatively free and open society, Western Europe, you had this history of no matter how smart and talented people at the BBC might be, and obviously there are immensely smart and talented broadcasters there, they were leaving stuff out. And so the first wave of, there's really kind of two waves of pirate broadcasting in Europe that I talk about in the book. The first one is sort of in the 1960s, people broadcasting from offshore and doing the commercial radio or the commercial music sounds that you could not hear on the government monopoly broadcasters, like early days of rock and roll. And it's, I mean, if you're a fan of The Who and their album The Who Sell Out, from, I don't remember, it's 66 or 67, it's sort of done as like a tribute to these stations that were playing The Who when it was much harder to hear The Who on standard British radio. The second wave of pirate broadcasters in Europe that I write about, they're not broadcasting from offshore, and they're generally non-commercial, and they're involved with these revolts from the left against mainstream society. And in particular, I get into discussion in Italy, where you had like Radio Alice and people organizing demonstrations on the air and so on. And that was also, and being raided by the government and so on, because they're not supposed to be broadcasting. Italy is interesting because they wound up being pressured on the one side by these pirate broadcasters, and on the other side by commercial private providers of cable TV, often just airing pornography, but having an audience for that. They wound up radically deregulating their airwaves in terms of who could go on the air, just letting far more, people being able to set up shop without jumping through all these hoops. And I can remember in the 80s being in Italy, and I didn't know about this history, but catching a radio station that was just playing a loop of, it was Do You Really Want to Hurt Me by the Culture Club. And they had sort of set it up so that midway through would hop back to the beginning of the station. It was completely self-indulgent, and really, if I want to point to like an example of how good a radio revolution can be, this is a terrible example. But if I want to just point to an example of how weird and open the Italian airwaves were, this is a good example. That this was, at least for that day, nothing but this one song. At any rate, though, in an American context, what often happens with government money is that there's, here we kind of get into the difference between public broadcasting, your classic sort of PBS, NPR, and the more alternative, community radio. Because with public broadcasting, I mean, the first public TV network in America was created in Alabama in the 1950s, and you can imagine, and really just funded by the Alabama state government. You don't think of 1950s Alabama generally when you think of precursors to PBS, but that's where it was, and you can imagine how they covered the Civil Rights Revolution. They didn't in the 1960s, and it got to the point where there was this kind of movement among some of the civil rights people to have them stripped of their licenses, and they wound up keeping their licenses but they kind of let more people on the air. But that's the kind of risk you get when you have direct government control. But even with subsidies, and lots of good stations have taken subsidies over the years, but there are often strings attached in terms of what you have to do to demonstrate the size of your audience, and then there are consultants who come in and say, well, if you want to maximize this audience, what I'm saying here is based on reporting I did in the 1990s, and I'm sure it's completely out of date in all sorts of ways, but the complaints I was hearing then had to do with basically consultants encouraging community radio stations to act much more like commercial radio stations in order to maximize their audience according to the metrics that the Corporation for Public Broadcasting was looking at, which were not the only possible metrics, but these, because it was sort of the counterpart to what was happening in the early days of radio regulation, when people saying we want the general interest station that appeals to everybody, not lots of niches that might appeal to different people. So, and I could get out the stuff in front of me about the specifics of these rules, but I've forgotten half of them, and I'm sure that half of them have changed since then. But
they're still there. They're still
there.
Well,
I don't think they're gone. I just assumed that the details of them have changed since I was exploring this stuff in 1998 or 7 or whenever I was writing that part of the book.
They're preventing us from getting hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, before I bring people on, I just have to, it's too delicious. to get into to avoid talking about this, because actually when you talk about these different categories, it's after you've written about the internal craziness that happened in Pacifica in the 1990s, which I directly participated in. So just, your reflections of these categories: benign dictatorship, the malign dictatorship, which I love, the monstrous bureaucracy, which would basically be, I guess, a community service grant from CPB, the benign democracy, the malign democracy, and then I love that time brokered snooze fest in the Civil War. I mean, so, and again, these things can apply now. I can think of examples of this right now, but just share with us, you created these great categories. What do you think about them being applied today in terms of community radio? Are we still alive with those kind of categories?
Oh, sure. I mean, I might rewrite that section in some small ways if I were writing it today. But I mean, basically the idea of a benign dictatorship was, all right, it's not a democratic station, but the person who's in charge has the vision and the means to keep people following this vision in a way that creates good radio. I think a pretty good example of this would be IKWFMU, which Ken Friedman has been running for ages. And I don't know if he would like being called a dictator, but he's been like the glue there for a long time, and I have not heard complaints about him. Who knows?
Yeah, he actually defines himself as a benign dictator. Anyway, go on.
Oh well, yeah. So
he's actually said that to me. Go on.
Did he say as a benign dictator? Or as
a benevolent despot.
So the risk, of course, when you have a dictator is, what if the dictator goes bad, or what if a new person takes over and isn't as good as that? And that's when you have the malign dictatorship, and then suddenly all kinds of mismanagement seeps in. So okay, we'll what if we try to do something democratic? Well, actually, there's the monstrous bureaucracy before that, and that's what, as you were saying, the kind of submission to these models being imposed by the people who the strings that come attached with these subsidies. If you completely submit to their vision, then democracy. Well, you can have the benign democracy, which is self-governing, and people, and you basically come to a general rough enough consensus that you're able to keep that singular vision with lots of diversity. But of course, then you can turn that into the malign democracy. What happens when self-governance goes wrong? And I guess the Civil War, Pacific has been through a few of those. I probably don't need to describe what happens.
It's a permanent cultural revolution. Go on.
Yeah, I remember I DJ'd for a while at a place called KSER north of Seattle. It was actually when Crab went off the air in 1984, some of the their foundation still existed, and they eventually got back on the air near Seattle, but not in Seattle, and on this other frequency, and they became KSER because I think someone else had taken the old call letters by then, and then eventually they broke with by the time I joined them, they had broken with the foundation because they felt the foundation was kind of in that monstrous bureaucracy mode. But I remember the general manager there, he often regaled me of the time that not at this station, but at another radio station, someone had pulled a knife in a meeting, debating who would get what time slot, and that was very much what he did not want to happen at this radio station. So that is the Civil War, and of course the time brokerage snooze fest is when everybody gets their own patch of the schedule. And there's really no connection necessarily between these different patches. And some of them inevitably are doing really good stuff, and some of them are doing really boring stuff because they ran out of ideas for what to do with their show years ago, but they still get to control this patch. And everybody manages to protect their turf. And if you live within range of one of these stations, you just sort of learn there are the hours when you want to tune your dial to it, and there are hours that you don't. And then the ideal form of community radio is the anarchic meritocracy, right? It's mostly governed by an informal collective? How do you become a part of this group? By being at the studios almost every day. How do you make your opinions count? By doing a good job. It's kind of the way you want things to work out. Whether any station has been able to maintain this ideal for any extended period of time, I will leave as an exercise for the imagination of the listener. But to me, that's the way you want things to work.
Well, Pacifica embodies all those topologies. Anyway, we're talking with Jesse Walker, who's the author of Rebels on the Air, an alternative history of radio in America. And everyone who wants to ask a question or a comment, just raise your little hands there on Zoom so I can get to you. Because of course, I'd sit here and love to pick his brain about this stuff. But if you want to ask a comment or question, please raise your hand. Kim, go on, Kim. Unmute, Kim. Kim, do you just have to unmute?
Stop, Jim. It takes a minute. Everybody, it takes a minute before. I didn't want to be first, but here I am, because here I am. And they're more like things I want to talk about than any particular question that you may or may not be able to answer, but touch on at some point. First of all, your book was published in 2001. A lot has happened in these last 20 years. Most of all, where we are at now is Pacifica is a failure. Financially, it's a failure. CPB does have the kind of listenership that they want, and we failed to be able to get anywhere close to that. And some people think that's a good thing. Some people think that's not a good thing. But the fact is, we don't have enough money to pay our bills. So what is your assessment of the current Pacifica? I would, in all your benign dictators and all that kind of stuff, I would say Pacifica really has just evolved into a cult, more than any of that. I also have an issue whether Pacifica can be defined as community radio. With the kind of signals that we have, KPFK in Los Angeles reaches across like 8 counties in Southern California. What is the definition of community radio? Just because we have volunteers, or is it, an actual community in 8 counties? Do we just try and pick off the most left-wing people? And I don't know. You don't have to answer that. These are just things that I've been thinking about for a long time.
That's always like a definitional thing. Is Pacifica community radio? I think Pacifica was an important precursor to community radio. It's part of what inspired, Lorenzo and Jeremy and other people who were started building community radio stations afterwards. But it was, even when it got in, Pacifica joined these, like the National Federation. I believe the individual Pacifica stations joined the National Federation of Community Broadcasters. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. Again,
we did, but we can't even afford to join anymore. Literally, we cannot afford.
Yeah, it was a, but even then it was sort of understood. It was understood that it was kind of, they were there because where else would you classify them? Because they weren't traditional public broadcasting. But at the same time, I think a lot of people understood that what they were doing, even by virtue of being a network, was somewhat different. And in fact, nailing down a single definition of community radio is itself fraught. There are a bunch of competing ones. This is one of those things I kind of brushed over when answering Jim's question earlier, because not only are there different ones, but it evolved over time. When CRAB was started, they didn't call it community radio. They thought of themselves as, we are radio for the elite, the intellectual elite, not the political or financial elite. But they
well, excuse me, I would argue that Lou Hill also saw it as more of an intelligentsia venue.
Absolutely.
Right.
I mean, Lewis Hill was not trying to invent, community radio. So this is an ideal that emerged over time. And a lot of it had to do with, just general social changes in the 1960s and 70s that, made community radio an ideal. And one reason why the phrase is there is just because you need to have some term for something for this broad third space that is neither public radio nor commercial radio. I mean, especially as, not, government radio. And so community radio kind of sometimes gets used as this kind of broader catch-all than it really should be used as. But I agree that, I mean, Pacifica is related to community radio, but it has always, even in days when it's, been much more successful than it is now, it's been doing something somewhat different, but overlapping. As far as how Pacifica is doing now, I mean, as I was telling Jim when we discussed, the show today, like one of the nice things about years after this book is that I no longer have to keep up with all the contending different factions and visions of Pacifica. I'm still on a bunch of the email lists, and sometimes I read it, sometimes I don't, but I'm not taking the sort of effort as a journalist or historian to dig down and say, this group has got this right or has got this wrong, and so forth. So I can't speak to the specifics of that, but I do know that the network is in terrible financial straits, and that, I mean, the last time I wrote something about Pacifica was a few years ago when there was talk. I mean, there's always talk of selling BAI, but this seemed like the most serious talk that had been, and then I guess it didn't happen. And what I wrote was more backwards looking and like, well, here's some of the high points of BAI in the past. But I mean, when I talk about figuring out what can you do on radio that you can't do elsewhere, that's something Pacifica has to think about too. But there's so many competing groups of stakeholders. I don't know if this is true now, but 20 years ago, when people ask me about it, I would often say, is there a reason for these 5 stations to all be under the same parent body? Should the network break into 5 and you can still have those kinds of share programming and all, but it's but if Houston can save itself and New York can't, one shouldn't drag down the other. By the same token, maybe being set free from the national organization might be able to. I mean, at this point, are there any nationally created Pacifica shows? I guess, is Democracy Now! Still being produced by Pacifica?
No.
It's separate.
No. Yeah, so even that's separate now. Yeah,
that's what she got out of the settlements in 2002.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't remember when but I was pretty sure it was no longer a Pacifica show, because I misstated that not long after it happened, and someone corrected me. So it stays whenever I make a mistake, it stays in my mind. So I hate to sort of sit here and offer that as my solution, because A, I don't know how much of a solution it is, and B, like I said, I'm not keeping up with all the ins and outs like I used to. But there really has to be a point at which you say, does it make sense for this to be an entity of 5 stations that is one big corporate body anymore? Could we be a part of like this sort of larger sea of community-based stations? But it was much easier to present that as an option back before all this stuff happened online that we were talking about at the beginning of the show, which now has changed the calculation on what can radio do that other places can't do. More and more other places can do a lot of these things that radio couldn't do before. So you got to be aware of that as well.
Yeah, no, Pacifica is essentially a Neanderthal when it comes to multi-platforming. And that's one of the things that I know myself and others have been arguing for 20 years. And we're now in a situation without any resources, and we're trying to grapple with that. Bruce, you had a comment there about some of the categories. Bruce Greif, do you want to unmute? Bruce?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could give an example or a couple of examples of the anarchic meritocracy in terms of real radio stations.
I think Kind Radio, which we talked about earlier, really got there. I mean, the guys who ran it, Joe and Zeal, they sort of presented themselves as the benevolent dictators. And then, with broadcasting from their house, they made these final decisions. But ultimately, you know, it was one of the things that was kind of a dictatorship in theory and an anarchic meritocracy in practice. So that kind of stays with me, because I spent some time, like, I was driving across the country, and they put me up. They owed me, because when they came out to, there was a big radio conference, a pirate radio conference in DC during the 1 year of my life that I lived in DC. And I put them up in my apartment, and they said, all right, you can stay with us when you, and then I moved out to California, and they put me up. So I got to stay there for a little while, sleeping in their transmitter room, which I got to tell you, was a nightmare. You know, not just because I was right next to this huge machine putting out this high-pitched whine all night, but because I was sleeping on literally a stack of dirty mattresses. But it was fun to watch the people all come in and out of the station and run their own shows, and watch all these different parts of, you know, the Texas Hill Country culture manifesting itself literally in their garage, because that's where the broadcast room was. It converted their garage. So that's probably the closest I've seen to that model being sustained for a fair amount of time.
I would suggest Wave Farm, which is a radio station upstate New York, is very similar to that sort of station. And
I interact with those guys on Twitter, and they seem like good guys, and I'm glad to hear that if that's how they run their station, I'm really glad to hear that.
I mean, they're really amazing. They actually have one channel which is a microphone in the middle of a pond on a raft, and they just play the pond sounds as well as all kinds of other stuff. And then Ardex FM, I think, does a lot of really interesting stuff. As a matter of fact, they define themselves as an art place, not necessarily a radio station. But those are the only two that I kind of know. But I did want to ask you, if you were a benevolent despot and you got pushed out of a plane with a parachute and you landed at Pacifico, what would you do?
I would say, I mean, again, I would have to look into the current situation, but I don't know if my 20-year-old advice to break in 5 is still a good idea.
I'm telling you, your advice from 20 years ago is the guy was smoking 20 years ago. He's still smoking. You know, the stuff you talked about hasn't changed. That's part of the problem. But I mean, we have the same issues that we had.
I mean, that would be my first thought, but I would pause to look around before putting it in action. But that is my instinct, is, you know, have these 5 stations be independent of each other, and obviously divvying up the kitty to the extent that there is. I mean, it might just ultimately mean divvying up the dead. I mean, there's all sorts of difficulties, practical difficulties, that I would not begin to be able to know, you know, even what the lay of the land is, like what the problems are, because I mean, all I know is, like, every time I talk with someone at Pacifica, they tell me some version of what you folks were just saying, like, we're out of money, often combined with complaints that person X, Y, or Z is stealing money, and that it's a bad situation in every ways, you know, financially and in many ways managerially. So in terms of how you could even get to the point where breaking in 5 is an option, I don't know.
Well, there are plenty of people who want to do that.
Yeah.
And some people are miraculously waiting for somebody to sit there and lay $20 to $30 million miraculously from the sky, which ain't going to happen. Kim, you got another comment? Go on.
Well, actually, if I'm coming down from the airplane and I'm DB Cooper, then I have that money in my backpack.
Yes,
yeah.
Okay, DB Cooper. Yeah, go on, Kim.
I just have a quick question, Jesse. I want to follow you on Twitter. What's your handle?
Oh, my handle is not Jesse Walker. It's NOT.
Okay, you're the not Jesse Walker.
WALKER. Yeah.
Okay, that came up first, and I'm like, well, that's not him.
No, it's that's why I never got verified, because what would it mean to verify that I'm not Jesse Walker? And there's this poor DJ, like a club DJ, I think in Canada, who's like also named Jesse Walker, and periodically people are mad at me about something political I've written and start yelling at him. And
Oh
Well, there are a
boy.
bunch of Jesse Walkers on there, so
yeah, there's like also a DJ in Utah who's a nice guy. We've communicated, and there's a weatherman, and yeah, but I'm the one who's, it says Rebels on the Air as part of my bio, so that's
Okay.
yeah.
Go on, Bruce.
So I'm wondering if internet radio, two questions. If internet radio is similar to FM radio, which came along and sort of rejiggered the puzzle. And then the second question is, do you think that listener call-ins or talk shows where listeners call in is something that community radio can do that nobody else can? Because that seems to be my impression.
First answer is pretty easy to give. Yes. I mean, it's different than FM in that you're not just opening up a whole new space, but A, the space is much larger, and B, the technologies are allowing you to do things that you could not do at all with traditional broadcasting in terms of who hears it, and I mean, it's all obvious ways, but yes, the metaphor, the comparison to FM is very well taken. And then call-ins, I would have said that a decade ago. With streaming now, you have sort of the equivalence of call-ins even happening, but it's true that people are that's still something that if you want to have something be sort of locally based and someone might stumble on it on a single while they're driving, you're more likely to have them come across it on the radio than on a live stream. But live streaming is opening up a lot of possibilities for internet broadcasting that or that are sort of encroaching on what in the past only radio could do.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen friends of mine create live streaming shows to get 50 to 60 to 70,000 people listening to them each episode, which is many times greater than any radio show at Pacifica. Anyway, any other comments from people? Just raise your hands. We're talking with Jesse Walker, the author of Rebels on the Air. And this is a book that was a really eye-opener to me. Well, Jesse, one question I wanted to just raise before we bring on Eric Jacobson is Stephen Donifer and micro radio. Your experiences with all that, because that, of course, was the rebel radio of the late 90s, all those demonstrations to set up low power FM stations, which the FCC decided to scupper. And, what do you look on all that in retrospect with what's going on right now?
Well, the FCC did create an LPFM service. It was much more limited than any of us wanted, but some people have gone on the air and done good things with it, which is good. But yeah, there was at least initially, and I think it stayed on the books, like a rule that people who had been fined for unlicensed broadcasting were not eligible for the LPFM, the low power FM licenses, which was a bummer. But yeah, so micro radio, basically this was another boom of non-commercial community broadcasting, sort of beginning in the late 1980s, but really flowering in the 90s. These people going on the air without licenses as pirates in the United States. And they came from a number of different backgrounds. I mean, like there was a vibrant commercial pirate scene in South Florida, for example, with lots of different immigrant ethnic groups having their own stations and playing the genres that they wanted to hear that were not elsewhere on the radio band and so on. You had some militia types who had pirate radio stations. You had all sorts, but a lot of it was people who wanted to do the kind of thing that was community radio in the 70s, but was less common as the field was getting a bit more professionalized, and the money from Washington was giving people different incentives that were not in line with what the rebel radio people wanted to do. So And there were some subgroups in that. There were a number of Black liberation radio stations, like set up in public housing projects. One of which was broadcasting as the projects were demolished, which is pretty impressive and interesting. You had ones like Free Radio Berkeley that were coming at things from a kind of anarcho-hippie kind of perspective, but really trying to rekindle the spirit of early community radio. And you had these places would have these conferences, and they'd come and swap tips and have like technical tips and programming tips and organize, and they talk about how to organize demonstrations and so on. I was involved in organizing a march in that year in DC. That was when the folks from Kind Radio were staying with me in 1998. So, and I mean, that came and went. There's still, I mean, a lot of the people who were involved in the West Philly pirate radio station went on to form the Prometheus Radio Project, which is a more traditional nonprofit that gets money from foundations and so on, but helps people go on the air and apply for these legal LPFM broadcast licenses. So there are still descendants of that activity going on, but it really was ultimately a 1990s moment. But yeah, actually, the first before I was working on the book as a book, I did a magazine story on microbroadcasting in 1995, and Stephen Dunifer was one of the main characters in it. And bits of that article our interviews from it were recycled into the book, and it was kind of, sort of the first bits of writing that eventually evolved into the book. So that's kind of was ground zero for me writing this.
Yeah, Dunifer was a trip. I met him in his little workshop down there in Berkeley. And Montez Press Radio is an interesting pirate radio operation going on now. They do art pop-up pirate radio for 3 days in New York. I will send you the email about them. Eric, your comments. Eric Jacobson.
So the reason I asked to be included is I'm not sure what the whether this is going to be posted on our common website, KPFTX, or just what. But to the extent that it gets circulation, I wanted to essentially take the opposing view to the notion that what ails Pacifica is the fact that it's functioning as a 5-city, 5-station, one network model. If anything, I think the future of Pacifica, I hope, if I have any role in it, and I'm a lowly member of the Los Angeles station, local station board, so I don't have any real influence on what goes on at the Pacifica National Board, where the plenary power lies. But I'm in favor of preserving the unity of the foundation. And what one of the reasons I got more actively involved, having been a listener since my childhood in Los Angeles in the late 50s and early 60s, and throughout the 60s when I was still in high school. And at any rate, I noticed that there's people up in Berkeley started taking the strong position somewhere around between 2003, when the new bylaws came in, and 2012, that the KPFA, which prides themselves on being the founding station and the flagship, I guess, to this day, decided they didn't want to be part of the foundation anymore, and they started doing all sorts of things to try to make that happen. And there's a whole history now spanning well over a decade about the machinations that have gone on. Carol Spooner, in particular, was one of the key figures and wrote an article that's still online saying that the Pacifica stations should have an amicable divorce from each other. And then she sketched out how the divorce settlement should look like. It's very, very, wild and crazy thinking, in my view, premised on some suppositions about the possible value of each station's signals and things like that. And then there was this very pernicious, in my view, effort to take over WBAI as a prelude to probably almost certainly putting it on the market. All this is so problematic. I couldn't begin to describe it in the limited time I have here, but there's a whole other side to the idea that the stations would be better off as individual stations. I think that it would squander an irreplaceable national treasure, which is the fact that it is a foundation that houses these 5 stations and could theoretically house more. Not that without, it's true that it would require some benefactors in some way, shape, or form, but the the idea that we would simply discard this national treasure for individual stations that would face the challenges of any radio station, to compete is, to me, folly. But I don't want to hog the mic here, but I did want to just anyone listening to this to know there's an entire other side, and I'd be happy to speak to anybody privately about it. Okay,
Well,
thank you, Jim.
Let me
Thank you,
say
Aaron.
something about national treasures. I think that no matter what happens, for God's sake, somebody save the archives. That is the real national treasure that Pacifica has, is the Pacifica archives, all these old programs, some of which have been digitized and online. But if Pacifica suddenly had an infinite amount of money, one thing I'd like them to do is get everything they can, those archives online, where people can hear them wherever they are forevermore.
Absolutely. Kenny Aaron.
So I'm not going to really tell you all my opinions because I'm not the one being interviewed here, but I wanted to ask Jesse if you are aware of and your opinion about what Pacifica calls its affiliates, which is numbers around 250 local stations, 250 stations around the country. And
those are a lot of the community radio stations I was talking
community
about.
radio stations.
Yeah, are affiliated in that way. Yeah.
And they're mostly in between, they're drive over country. They're not East and West Coast so much. And that's another resource or outreach or avenue for opportunity, inflow and outflow for Pacifica. But also, when you, at the beginning of this, you mentioned that there used to be a program where you had diverse political opinions, or even, but I don't see any reason why community radio stations or left-wing or any kind of a station wouldn't take an opposing viewpoint, give somebody half an hour, and come up with a commentary and tear it apart if you want, or have a program where you take both sides of an issue. So it was more entertaining to hear outrageous, over the fringe radio rather than, oh, we all know what's right, let's agree. So I wanted to know on those two things. You think that Pacifica's service to this associate small community radio stations has potential that hasn't been realized? And do you think that the community radio or other radio stations should have the nerve to go out and cover material that is dangerous?
Well, certainly there's a long history. I'll do the first question first, obviously. Certainly there's a long history of community radio stations running programming from Pacifica, that fits their format, and they think this is good. Again, I don't know how much Pacifica is actually producing these days, but certainly, so I don't know what those affiliate relationships look like these days. I'm out of the loop. But if there's a really good program being produced at KPFT Houston, and you think someone in Wisconsin might want to air it, absolutely, share it with them. I even if it's not a national program, that's always been a part of like this community radio networking, and it always should be. As far as bringing, there's a long history especially in the early days of Pacifica, of having people who are not sort of standard left voices on it. National Review, the famous flagship conservative magazine, provided commentaries for a while, and then they withdrew them because they didn't want to be on the same station as communists. They always say we will be on the same station as socialists, but not communists. But Caspar Weinberger, future Reagan administration official, had a Pacifica show. There are plenty of other examples as well. I think having a diversity of views is good. I would not get stuff just to be shocking, though. I mean, if you just want to hear something shocking, you can go. That's another thing you can get online. And I think there should be some, question of quality. Like you want to have a conservative voice, but have it be, the thoughtful conservative who's going to maybe put forward some ideas that people want to engage with. Not like let's find Michael Savage to say something, wild and offensive, because I mean, A, why waste your airwaves on that? And B, again, you can find that online, online easily, So it's more a matter of like saying, what are the folks outside our, my advice to, this is not just Pacifica, my advice to any broadcaster who wants to have a variety of views is like, whatever your perspective is, whether it's leftist or something completely different, is think about what are the folks who you should be engaging with, what's going to challenge your view, but in a productive way, and let that be. And then who else is in your circles here at the station? Who do they want to engage with? It's going to be different people than you. And then as you start to bring in these different people who are, have different perspectives than you do, they're going to have other suggestions as well. And you can build out gradually in that way, and not just go for, who's most outrageous or who's most famous or something like that.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. And who are you? Who are you? Can you unmute? Who are you? You want to ask a question? Who are you?
Oh, yes. There's the person called Who Are You?
Yes. Who are you? We'd like to know, who are you?
This is like an Abbott and Costello routine here.
Yes, I guess so. Who's on first? Thank you. Thank you. Who are you? That's good to reflect on. Who are you? And I should add, the affiliates are just a fantastic aspect of Pacifica. It's one of the bright spots in the whole network. It's just amazing to get on the phone with the affiliates and just listen to them. It's just like night and day from all the Michigas one has to put up with in the network. Kim, you have the last word here, unless Who Are You wants to say something. Kim, go on.
No, I want to hear from Who Are You?
Well, who are you?
If you have your hand raised and you're not named Kim, unmute yourself and speak.
There you go. Who are you? Yes, thank you. Your comment, sir. Who are you?
All right. Yeah, this is Michael Novick. I'm.
Michael. Thank you.
Yeah. Former chair of the local station board at KPFK and now the interim general manager at KPFK. I did want to make some comments, and maybe they'll form into a question. I think that the history you ran through missed a couple of very significant elements having to do with the state role. One was the elimination of the fairness doctrine under Reagan that impacted, commercial broadcasting and radio and TV. And the other was in 1999 and 2000, there was a very concerted effort to go after Pacifica in particular. Larry Pressler, was the senator, sent around a letter to a lot of the public broadcasters asking who on your staff has ever worked for Pacifica. And so I think that reflects the fact that Pacifica, because of its tremendous potential, and speaks to also Eric's point, I think that the reason to try to maintain Pacifica is that it has the potential of a counterweight to a lot of other broadcasting and to the domination of both public and commercial broadcasting by corporate influence. And I think that leaving it only to individual stations is not sufficient. I think that we have to amass ourselves, and both as the foundation and with the affiliates. I'll point out, for example, COVID Race and Democracy, which is nationally produced Pacifica show. It's produced by volunteers primarily, and it's produced with input from the 5 stations and from the affiliates. They incorporate content from the affiliates, which is not the normal procedure much at Pacifica. But I think that the other element that you're neglecting is that the CPB, the FCC, over a period of time have been dominated by people coming out of institutional U.S. propaganda operations like Voice of America, and I forget the umbrella organization they now have. It has some name that incorporates, a Radio and TV Marti and Radio for Europe and so on. And those people are very highly placed within both the Federal Communications Commission and the CPB. And I think that the purpose of Pacifica, I'm not talking about a particular line. I think there's plenty of room for debate and disagreement across the spectrum. I would violently oppose, not violently, I would strongly oppose any idea of giving a platform to someone like Milo Yiannopoulos or any of these people who are coming out of the alt-right and trying to push the Overton window towards fascism in this country. But I think that Pacifica has the capacity to try to push back. And I think we have to exercise that and, to widen the spectrum of political discourse that takes place in this country with room for the left that does not exist now in public broadcasting or commercial broadcasting. And pretty evident to that, or on social media for that matter. Look, they write that Chris Hedges, his entire over for 6 years or something was wiped out by YouTube because they claimed he was a Russian propagandist or because he had something to do with RT. And so I think that in the 60s, the impulse you talked about came out of the fact that there were a lot of exposures of national security state control of other media. All the stuff it was the ramparts about the NSA, the CIA controlling the National Student Association, controlling the international wing of the AFL-CIO, controlling and paying for academicians and journalists to put government propaganda into academic work and into publications is why there was such an interest in alternative media, including Pacifica in that period. In the 80s, the Iran-Contra and the secret wars the U.S. was waging and with death squads is the reason why Pacifica, was able to regenerate itself. Subsequent, KPFK had a big burst of support and increase in financial support as well in the period after 2003. Under the W. Bush, because of the war in Iraq and so on and so forth. And so up to 2008, we were doing quite well at KPFK, and we were raising $1 million at a time in short fund drives. After that, we began to diminish, and I think that it's important to recognize that there's a political struggle going on in this country right now about authoritarianism, about fascism, and we have to be aware that that's the context in which anything that takes place at Pacifica is happening. There's a tendency in certain people in Pacifica who think that we have to somehow defend the Democratic Party as a way to deal with that, and I think that that's a narrow political definition. I think we have to have much more openness to a lot of cultural expression and a lot of political expression that are not bound up within the context of what the U.S. political spectrum is, which is a very, very narrow political spectrum that is given any legitimacy or access to airwaves. And I think that, I would support the idea of having discourse and debate about a lot of things that Ken mentioned, although not proto-fascist views and not fascist views. But I think that there's plenty of room for debate and discussion on what's called the left in this country, and we have to be open to that and to understand that there's not one point of view that's going to dominate. And I think there's also ways of it being expressed culturally that we've been very remiss in not reflecting. I think that arts and culture are not elite. Arts and culture are being created, at the grassroots level and by a very, very diverse group of people in this country now, and those are things that we need to get in our airways as well. So there's no exact question to this, but I would say if you wrote your book, whatever it was, a number of years ago, I think there's a lot of stuff missing from this discussion.
Well, I'll just throw in a couple comments. You did spark a thought. Because I remember listening to the Iran-Contra coverage on KPFT back in the 80s as a teenager. And of course, one other thing that you can do that other places can't do, it's not medium specific, is do top-notch journalism, that people will want to go to you for. So obviously that is, and Pacifica at its best has certainly done a lot of that. So that is certainly should be part of the discussion. And I wrote a whole book. There is some discussion of, I don't think the Larry Pressler business is in there, I don't recall, but certainly other times when the repressive arm of the state came against Pacifica and against other radio stations. So yeah, that definitely is part of the story. And other things that you mentioned in there do come up in the book as well. I guess I would, I don't know. I should just take more calls. I don't know if there was more you wanted. There wasn't really a question there. So, but it is absolutely certainly the case that both that direct repression is part of what I talk about, and that investigative and journalism that tries to expose the wrongdoing of people in power is part of what any iteration of Pacifica should be doing.
Thank you, Jesse. These are wonderful discussions, and it's clear that in talking with you, Jesse, I would love to have the opportunity to have you come on again and then pick your brain and have you talk with us out loud about this down the road. I have Otis on the phone here. Otis McClay, are you there? Mr. Otis.
I see his photo with the cat.
Yes, but he's for some reason not jumping in there.
He is not muted anymore. Are you going to say something, Odie?
Otis.
I'm having to do all kinds of things to get us to work because I have all this stuff. Hi, Jesse.
Hey, how you doing? I used to call into Otis McClay's radio show on KPFT when I was a teenager in Galveston. So he is one of my early connections to Pacifica.
I taught him everything he knows. Yeah.
I did come by once and DJ. You might remember that. I stopped by the station and you let me DJ for half an hour on KPFT. So
no,
you were in like 87, 88, 89. Must have been 89, I think. Yeah.
You were one of the great callers.
Thanks.
And I still tell the story when they were, I don't know if you remember this, doing goth. When you were in, where were you? You were in like Seabrook or Clear Lake?
Like Galveston.
In Galveston. Yeah. And the schools banned wearing black.
Right. And and some of the students, wear green.
Yes.
You should let the word go out that the new satanic color is green, and when they ban that, just keep moving through the rest of the rainbow until everyone has to go to school naked. They didn't take my advice. Someday I should write a teen comedy. That's the theme.
It's too lucid. Yeah. It makes too much sense. You can't accept that kind of advice easily.
Well, one of the things I wanted to offer is that Michael brought up some really important issues, some of which I agree with, some of I don't agree with. I do think Pacifica has a role to communicate with different groups of Americans, including those that are Trumpsters. Because as Mr. McClay always says, how are we paying attention to the people we fly over from the east to the west coast? We're not. We're not paying attention to them. We're not trying to dialogue with them.
Well, they're not smart. They're farmers and people like that. What do they know?
And I do think it's important. And what Michael's raising is, it was actually Senator Pressler in the 94 is when he started that. Have you ever been a member of Pacifica or not? Because I remember he
wrote the DMCA. He was the big anti-child pornography guy. That was the basis on which they wrote it.
Was that, again, this has been so long, but was that in the wake of the, like David Horowitz was complaining about the African Mental Liberation Weekend stuff on KPFK? Was that the context of that?
That was part of it, but Pressler was sort of a disillusioned two-tour Vietnam veteran who ran for Senate in, was it South Dakota or North Dakota? He came from, or Wyoming or something.
South Dakota.
South Dakota.
Where my grandparents lived. I spent time there.
And he actually, had his Amazing Grace moment later when he sort of worked with Senator Kerry McCain with the POW MIA issue. So, Pressler's sort of a mixed bag dude in his old age. but he did indeed come up with those egregious comments, which united everybody in public broadcasting. But it's really been terrific. And does anybody else have any more comments before? Because I know we've been having a great conversation. I know you have kids and all that, and you don't want to keep you from them. But does anybody have any final comments they'd like to make before we bid Jesse a fond adieu?
I want to ask him just a question, because it was, it was experience at Cato and everything. It's been my position. They asked Ron Paul years ago, who did he talk to in Congress? Because he was very marginalized. And his answer was David Kucinich. And I've always felt that that's actually where the dialogue is. And I mean, I don't listen to everything, but I haven't heard any, I don't think I've heard any real libertarians in the media. I hear the crazies, but I haven't heard any, real discussion about those points of view. And what Ron Paul saying about David Kucinich, it kind of suggests that, that's where the circle meets. We start here with the left and the right. Ron
Paul's then chief of staff, when he was still in office, I had a conversation with him, and it was not on the record. I don't know. I mean, he's not in office anymore. I mean, I won't go into specifics, but he was talking about who Ron Paul got along with best in Congress, and let's just say certain left-wing people, and it wasn't even Kucinich, so I bet he would have said him too, were ranking a lot higher than certain prominent Republicans at the time. So he was always eager to do that kind of, and actually this kind of brings us back to the beginning of the beginning of the show. Kind Radio was in his district, and he would talk on the air with them, and they were never quite sure if he understood that they were illegal or not, but he would take their calls. And when they came to DC and we had that demonstration and so on, I brought them, a bunch of radio people went to lobby their Congress people, and I went along with them when they went to talk with Ron Paul. And unfortunately, it didn't go very well, because they launched into the entire history of the station, and you could tell from watching the congressman's face that he wasn't sure what. It started with an attempt to censor a print publication they were doing, and that's why they decided to start a radio station. And they start with this whole discussion, and he's like, "So, do you want me to help with this censorship?" It didn't go that well, but it does have this kind of full circle feeling, because those Kind Radio hippies, I don't think they voted for Ron Paul, but they were happy to reach out to him for help when they felt like he might be of service.
Well, Michael, do you have any final comments? Michael Novick?
I think I made my main point. I think in the current period, we do have to figure out ways to supplement what we can raise over the airwaves with off-air fundraising. I think that's vital. So I think that includes community events, and those are sometimes difficult, but we've been doing some online here at KPFK, and we'll do more of those. The idea of I think one of the things about the social media is that we can monetize them. So I support the effort to try to get our work onto a lot of other platforms. This goes back to the earlier part of the discussion about what's changed in the whole media environment. And I think that I do want to say that I think one appeal that we should make to people about terrestrial radio is that we are not selling their ears to anyone, and we're not selling their data to anyone when they listen on the radio. And I think that people will be increasingly conscious of that and value that, as all this stuff with Twitter and everything, the Meta and so on. I think that we have to make that argument with people, and I think it's a valid one to make, and that free will donations to support a station like that, and the opportunity to have that kind of unmediated and I don't know what word to use. The fact that it's not, we're not, by listening to the radio, you do not become part of the big data collection that is being used for surveillance and propaganda and psychological manipulations of consumers, I think is how to modernize the pitch for the appeal that Pacifica makes about what kind of broadcast offerings we have. And I think that we're not sufficiently pushing that forward to people in a context in which actually that's a vital selling point.
Right. Good point. Well, Jesse, you have the last word. And we've been having a great pleasure talking with Jesse Walker, the author of Rebels on the Air, an alternative history of radio in America. Jesse, your last comments for the day. Thank you. And thank you so much for spending time with us today talking about this.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's been good to revisit these subjects and talk with, I noticed before this, Jim, that you're in the acknowledgments of this book. I must have interviewed you at some point way back when. So thank you for returning the favor. The Healthy Station Project is one of the things I was alluding to when I talked about the strings that came attached with CPB money and the way those were used to steer people towards certain forms of audience building that are not always aligned with the traditional values of community radio. And it's one of the things I talk about in the book. It's interesting that it was originally called something like Project Blueprint, which sounded maybe a little too dystopian. So you can see why Healthy Station Project might sound a bit more appealing to people. I think we've gone through a whole lot of this subject, and I hope we gave some food for thought to people.
Well, thank you so much, Jesse. Everybody, thank you so much for participating. And we've been talking with Jesse Walker, Rebels on the Air, an alternative history of radio in America. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do they laugh? Do they love? Like they say in every song. It is true, that's where I belong. Do they laugh? Do they love? Like they say in every song.